Thank you, Jean, and thank you for a very warm welcome to a very cold Scotland. But it is just as cold as south of the border, so that's all right. I think Jean's introduction is apt in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about today. And picking up, first of all, on Nora's points this morning, we have seen policy and financial interventions in early childhood education in the last 20 years as being unprecedented. They have brought transformative changes into the lives of children, families, and practitioners. But for me, and that has been really important, otherwise we just wouldn't be here today. But for me, there is a tipping point between a policy logic and a policy illogic. So I think it's important to do a little bit of policy learning when people come across the border, just so that you are very careful about not adopting some of the more pernicious effects of policy intensification in early childhood. So, the focus today I have picked up on the aim of understanding children's learning journeys, attainment and learning outcomes. I was also sent an advance copy of the Scottish Early Childhood Transition Statement, and the statement that really jumped out for me that was relevant to today's presentation I've put up here. And it's this idea of recognising previous learning, building on what has gone before. And obviously, alongside that, we have introducing change, complexity and challenge into children's lives. I was also really interested when I read this statement because you don't use the word school readiness. And I think they are so imprinted upon my brain from so much of the focus on school readiness in English policy documents. So I was really pleased to see there that you are keeping those words of transition, progression, continuity, a sense of belonging, all of those concepts that continue to be really important in the lives of children and families. So that is my focus. I've chosen some organising concepts for today's presentation that reflect a lot of the work I've done in the past, but also building on the work that I'm currently doing with colleagues at the University of Sheffield in England, at the University of Auckland with Professor Helen Hedges, and with Professor Joss Nuttall and colleagues in Melbourne, Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. So this is a truly international agglomeration of ideas. And I want to look very briefly at ideas about a co-constructed curriculum. So just to bring some messages from the south of the border, what we have in England at the moment is the increasing intervention of the Office for Standards in Education in all of these aspects of early childhood education and more widely early childhood provision. We're also seeing the intensification of power effects of policy discourses for practitioners, children and families, to the extent that in England Ofsted is now the sole arbiter of quality. And picking up on Nora's points this morning, I think it really is important that we have evidence-informed and evidence-based policy. What Ofsted documents give us in England is policy-led evidence. So I'm just going to give you an example of this here. The report Bold Beginnings is all about school readiness, and it's had a lot of purchase in England. So first of all, we have an appeal to the emotions of early childhood practitioners, because who on earth would want to increase the painful consequences of children falling behind their peers? Secondly, we have a very strong rationale for why Bold Beginnings was important. It was entitled to ensure that the EYFS is appropriately designed to prepare pupils for year one, to the extent that the transition year, the reception year, which as you know is age 4 to 5, is now officially the transition year. In other words, you don't have the full benefits of the EYFS and that mix of pedagogical approaches, because the expectation is that the transition to formal learning is taking place before the transition to year 1. And we also have the moral basis of the argument, because in Bold Beginnings, Ofsted argue very strongly that the proposed solutions are based on strong evidence. However, if you go to the very end of Ofsted policy documents, I'm a very sad person. You'd think I had better things to do with my life, really, wouldn't you? If you go to the end of the Ofsted policy documents and you look at their sources of evidence, they are very limited. Ofsted are drawing on government-funded research, which obviously has a particular remit. They're also drawing on government-commissioned reports, and they frequently draw on Ofsted annual reviews and reports as well. So I have argued in 2 recent papers that this creates a circular discourse, that Ofsted sets out the problems, Ofsted sets out the solutions that we're supposed to follow, but does not offer us the range of evidence that Nora was talking about this morning from independent research. So I have argued that Bold Beginnings, taken together with the early years foundation stage, produce this new assemblage of desired practices, and they act to produce the school-ready child. So this, I would argue, is a policy fabrication, for the simple reason that I think that children are always and everywhere ready to learn, because they are so curious, they are active, they are sociable, they are always wanting to know more. They're in a perpetual and sometimes quite annoying state of readiness for wanting to learn, and more importantly, for wanting to become more knowledgeable about the worlds in which they live. So, what we also have, again, this is a very strong appeal to the emotions of the early childhood community, are these discourses of vulnerability and resilience, as though these 2 things are polar opposites. So as you're reading this, I'd just like to make the argument that children can feel vulnerable in one context and resilient in another. In a doctoral thesis done by one of my students on transitions, she found that one of the 5-year-old children said, "I thought it was going to be really exciting, but actually it's quite boring." One of the things that they were anxious about was what she came to understand as containers. So, for example, having your pencil case with you at all the time, because that contained all the things that you need. Make sure that you have your backpack always on the back of your chair. That is another container that brings to school all of the things that you need. So the children were quite anxious about always making sure they had all of the right things, having their coats on their pegs, things being in the right place. So they were resilient about some things, but really quite anxious about others. They were also anxious about the number of rules they had to learn and remember and implement at the same time. So this is why we need to ask children about discourses of vulnerability, anxiety and resilience, because they're the best ones to tell us. So, again, what policy in England is driving is changes in the child, changes in family practices, because as we know, the practices of the school sometimes colonise family practices in the home, and it isn't always the kind of two-way flow that we would ideally like. And changes in the preschool, ensuring that the reception year is now the transition year, with evidence of formal and direct teaching, especially in literacy and numeracy. So, you probably know this already, but I just wanted to reinforce, how is the school-ready child constructed through policy? And the most important sentence for me is the last one here, that practitioners must indicate whether children are meeting expected levels, exceeding expected levels, or not yet reaching expected levels. And that final category is called emerging. Now, if you know the work on emergent literacy, emergent numeracy, emergent mathematics, you'll know that emergence is theoretically a very powerful concept, and it's one that really informed a lot of my practice when I was a nursery teacher. However, emerging in the early years foundation stage is now analogous with being at risk and in need. In other words, emerging is part of what might be seen as a deficit discourse about children who are barely 5 years old. There are also concerns in existing literature that the category of emerging also becomes a site for marginalisation of differences and diversities. So the policy problem that is constructed here is that the very solutions that policies are offering may be counterproductive to achieving those solutions. And that is why I have come with concerns about policy learning from another jurisdiction. So I just want you to hold on to that, because I hope that the rest of the presentation is going to be a little more optimistic. So before I go on, is there anything that anybody would like to comment or say about that? Is it familiar up here? No? Some nods, some shakes of the head. Okay. So I'll leave you with those ideas to think about. So, here am I being off message again. I'm not really quite sure whether this piece of graffiti says rebel or rebel, but either way, this is the space that I'm still in. So what alternative discourses are available to us? And I argue that it is not enough for us to keep saying, oh, children must play, children learn through play. It's not specific enough, it's not a strong enough response to current policy discourses. We have to find a much, much stronger narrative of what it is about play that is important. We need a much stronger narrative about contemporary theories of learning, not just child development theories as the foundational basis for early childhood education. And we need to make sure that we are drawing on independent research and reliable research reviews to show that we are drawing on strong and reliable evidence to act back against policy, to act with policy, because that's important as well, but also to point up the illogic of policy where we find it. So, what kind of discourses, what kind of theories, what kind of research can we draw on to help us to have a strong narrative in the early childhood community? So these are the three concepts I have chosen to talk about today, and they're three of the ideas that I have been working with in recent research. So working theories, children's interests, and funds of knowledge. And I'm sure that many of you are already very well acquainted with these concepts and their place within early childhood education. But again, I think sometimes we have paid lip service to the idea that the curriculum must be built around children's interests, because the research tells us that actually we're often not very good at identifying what those interests are. And it's really heartening to see some heads nodding in the audience. So is this a familiar thing? Okay. Can anybody give an explanation or a hunch as to why we're not very good at identifying children's interests? Or sometimes we might identify them, but we're not very good at building on them.
I think sometimes we pick up on the context rather than the actual process that they're using. When we push and pull, but they're into dinosaurs or cars, we automatically see them playing with cars and start putting more things out.
Yes. So you might not delve into what lies behind that interest in dinosaurs or cars or whatever it might be. Would you agree with that? Again, there's a lot of heads nodding in the audience.
Is that thing about acting too quickly, not taking time to...
Could be yes, it could be. It could be acting too quickly, acting sometimes on our presumptions as well. Okay, right. So, children's interests, funds of knowledge and working theories. I want to acknowledge the background to some of these ideas because they have derived from some very powerful foundational research in New Zealand. And I know that Sally has been a part of this research, so apologies for this being familiar territory. Sally, you can go to sleep for 5 minutes. The Te Whāriki in New Zealand is the early childhood curriculum framework. Working theories are part of the learning outcomes of Te Whāriki. Helen Hedges, the work of Helen Hedges at Auckland University, and many of her doctoral students and team members have said that although they're partial, sometimes partial or emergent, they're nevertheless open to development and modification over time. So children build working theories in many different contexts. They're expressed and developed within their peer cultures because this is where children collaboratively construct and share their funds of knowledge. And their funds of knowledge may be located in many, many different sources. They can be everyday events and family practices. They can be through their digital play, their everyday traditional play, and popular culture. And the work of Jackie Marsh, again at Sheffield University, tells us that popular culture is sometimes derided within early childhood education, but is a constant source of knowledge, fascination, and deep engagement for children. So I think we might need to think carefully about some of our attitudes to popular culture. And some of the research I'm going to show you a little later on is about children's deep interests in matters of life, death, and dying, and big existential issues of life. Okay? So, again, to clarify, working theories are tentative, evolving ideas, and I really like this idea that Hedges and Jones propose, that children think, ponder, wonder, and make sense of the world in order to engage more effectively within it. And I wonder whether we're still giving children the time to stop and think and ponder and wonder, or moving them constantly towards this elusive goal of school readiness. Working theories are strongly linked to cognition through the idea of cognitive inquiry, again developed as they theorise about their world and their experiences. And this idea of children being real-world theorisers I've always found really intriguing, not least because sometimes their theories are very creative, but again, because they're open to adaptation, they modify, they change, they rework their theories over time. And as Hedges and Jones argue, they create a framework for making sense of new experiences and ideas. Now, I think it's also important to say that it's not just the children that create these frameworks. The adults, practitioners, teachers, parents, and family members all have important roles in the process. I'm the very last person to advocate a laissez-faire approach where children are just left to play and develop and emerge on their own without the important scaffolding of people, resources, places, materials and things. Okay, so we now have some emerging research that is linking these important ideas of children's interests, working theories, and funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge, again, we know derive from diverse sources in children's lives. Again, everyday events, popular culture, the media comes up an awful lot in research. And I don't just mean adverts, I mean the digital world that we're all a little bit concerned about, to say the very least. So funds of knowledge may reflect everyday social and cultural practices, cooking, shopping, hobbies, work, family interests and activities. And I'm going to illustrate some of those ideas in a minute. So, as I said earlier, Hedges and Cooper have identified a gap in theorising the nature of children's interests, and exactly what you said earlier, the importance of moving beneath the surface of those choices to understand children's big questions and inquiries and how they relate to funds of knowledge. Research I've recently done with Michelle Hill, based on her doctoral thesis, argues that play provides a range of contexts for the expression of those interests, with the potential for those interests to be sustained and developed over time. And I think that's really important, because in the context of early childhood frameworks that reduce play by the age of 5, that is the very age at which play is developing in complexity. Complexity of cognition, the ability to generate rules, the language development and language use in play. So we're actually taking away from children a really important area of progression in their play lives. And if you think about it, play doesn't even stop at 6 or 7. Play is a lifelong capability or disposition. If you've got one of these in your bag, you're only several clicks away from worlds of play. My daughter is a very enthusiastic Scrabble player, and she will still play a traditional board game. But if she's got some time, she goes and plays Scrabble with people. She doesn't know where they are. But there they are, this community of Scrabble players all coming together through this. So play is so much part of all our lives. Why are we reducing the opportunities for children? Why are we denying children the opportunities? Because policy says children need less play at 5. Doesn't necessarily mean that they need more play. They need time for play to build in complexity and challenge. So, again, Liz Chesworth's work argued that play are the sources and areas of knowledge that have movement and direction over time. So, I'm going to illustrate some of these ideas with reference to 2 very different research projects. The first research project Liz and I have just completed. It was, and we're currently writing it up, it was in a multi-diverse nursery in one of the poorest areas of a northern city. There are around 26 languages spoken in the school, and you might go into the nursery and say, oh my goodness, the language development of these children is terrible. It's really delayed. But if you spend time in the nursery, as we did, we found that the children had multimodal ways of communication. They were translanguaging. They were going between their home languages and English, because English was the language of the nursery setting. They were asking each other what words meant in their own home languages. So there was an awful lot of language going on, but it might not have been the kind of language that would have enabled the practitioners to tick many of the boxes on the early learning goals. So it's not just what you look at, it's what you listen to, it's where you look and what you pay attention to. So here is Sesuna. I'll just let you read that. So you know when children do repeated actions in their play, and you don't know whether it's because they can't think of anything else to do, but you don't necessarily know where it comes from. So our conversations with the parents and the families of the children who took part in this research shows that there are very good reasons for Sesuna to return to the water tray, because she always asked for bubbles to be added. And why she constantly washed the baby's foot, the doll's foot. And you can just imagine a mother having an enthusiastic baby sister wanting to do some washing, and you say, okay, just wash the foot, because the rest of it might just be a little bit too delicate to be washed by an enthusiastic older sister. And again, you might just record this. Sesuna likes washing the baby in the water tray. But what I would argue is that what sits behind Sesuna's work is a whole load of other cognitions. Now, for example, we know that metacognition and self-regulation are really important for transition to school, for school readiness. So Sesuna is bringing knowledge from her home into a nursery school. She is finding a new context in which to express her knowledge. She is doing that in a playful way, but she is symbolically representing that knowledge. Now, we know that symbolic representation in play is about higher order thinking. So although that she often did this quite silently and almost meditatively, if you start to dig behind the actual activity, there's an awful lot that we can say about why this is important for Sesuna. Is this triggering things for you about children in your own practice? Because often little vignettes do that. Okay, so let's now go to Anenye, and we have a similar type of story here. Okay, so again, his sustained play interest in animals in the nursery clearly has antecedents in the home, but he isn't just bringing an interest in the animals, he's already showing deep knowledge of the animals, about their lives, wanting to find out more, but importantly, knowing what those sources of knowledge are. So it's chatting with your parents, it's reading books, it's watching television. It's finding out where knowledge resides and how you can use that knowledge in the context of play. So again, we've got quite a lot of carrying. I know Sally's used the image of a backpack of how children bring knowledge backwards and forwards between home and educational settings. There's quite a lot of transfer of knowledge, and importantly, although Anenye is not yet writing, he's able to represent his knowledge and understanding in quite dynamic ways, because these dinosaurs are clearly doing things with and to each other. So those are just two examples from children aged 3 to 4 years old who were not long off their transition into the reception class when we finished the project. And I only hope that when they do make that transition, they are not seen as being in deficit, because these children have a great deal of knowledge, but they may just be expressing it in multimodal ways, not just via language. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to, just checking the time, I'm going to move on now to a very different project. This was conducted in an international school in a European country. The children are between 5 and 6 years old. In terms of socio-economic status, you would say they were very, very different from the children in this nursery in a northern city. So these children are very articulate. They are also, even at age 5 and 6, they are able to have sustained periods of play in their classroom. So again, there are many multilingual children in the classroom, but the language of the classroom is English, and you can see that the children are very, very articulate. The study was conducted by one of my doctoral students, Michelle Hill. She was the teacher in the classroom, but she took on the role of teacher-researcher. So she decided she was going to research whatever happened. So that's the interesting thing about research, because you never know what's going to happen. And the children devised a game which they played for 3 months, and the game was called Dead Forever. And it may seem really rather strange that children played at being dead and coming alive and being covered up and being buried, and all sorts of different themes came into this, along with other areas of knowledge from popular culture. So there were a lot of ghosts and a lot of zombies coming in and out of this play as well. So the children went between real-world, everyday, existential issues and again, their knowledge of popular culture. Oh, sorry, I should have said this. Let me just skip back a little bit. Outcomes of the previous project. We were looking at children's curriculum making at home. And what we're writing about at the moment is the importance of multi-generational family practices and multilingual communication, and again, the importance of popular culture. Popular culture came up a lot, to the extent that one mother said that her child in the nursery spent a lot of time with her bigger sister watching YouTube videos on makeup, how to put on makeup, because it's very complicated these days, putting on your makeup. And the mother said, but we are Muslim. I'm really worried what the values and the practices my children are learning about. So that was a family, in transition. So there were some lovely, lovely instances of that, of the families questioning and pondering and wondering about what their children are being exposed to in a very different culture and context. Okay. So here we are in Michelle's thesis. In the literature review for the paper that we've just written together, we looked at all the literature on children's interests, and this is a list of the themes that come up in the literature. I'm just going to ask you to read those and see if there's anything that surprises you. Are they all familiar themes in your settings? Anything that surprises you? Okay. The search and rescue one is Amanda Bateman's work, again in New Zealand, where she was investigating children's play after the Christchurch earthquake. And the children were playing with digging holes, buildings and lorries falling into the holes. So much of what they heard on the news, what they experienced in their everyday lives, they were actually making sense of as well. So, those are some of the things that have come up in an international literature review. And here is Michelle's Dead Forever play with 5- and 6-year-old children. And what I want to demonstrate here is this is where we are seeing language complexity and challenge. But I would argue that that is the complexity and challenge we saw in the nursery school is equally important. So I'm just going to let you read this. I'm sure you're very familiar that children will always work the word bum into their play at any opportunity. It's just one of those things you're given permission to do in the context of play. But again, this very powerful let's pretend I died. And that is always the invitation for people to come into that space and go with the idea of, let's see what we know about what it means to be dead. So all of a sudden, you've got all of these ideas coming in. He's dead, we have to wrap him up. And when Michelle and I were talking about her data, we were saying things like, where do they know that from? Where's that come from in the lives of 5- and 6-year-old children? This is a multicultural setting, so it could again have come from religious, from cultural, from family practices. He's all white. Where have they got the idea that that's what happens when you die? His feet and his arms are white. So you get this repetition, this reinforcement of what it means to be dead, because they're sharing the narrative, they're establishing the shared goals and the shared ideas about play. And here's Peter, Tracy and Cara. Okay. So, and again, you know, at one level, we have this very factual exchange. Do you want to be dead? No. Can you breathe? Right? So they're checking out what's happening here, because you always have that liminal space in play between real, not real, play, not play. And throughout many of these episodes, there are some moments of uncertainty and sometimes some moments of discomfort, as we have here. No, I don't like it. I want to come back alive. So the tissues have very powerful material significance in the context of this particular set of play routines, because they signify being dead. So if you don't get covered in tissues, you come alive. So again, what lies behind this? Again, you could say, oh yes, this is really weird, isn't it? The children are interested in death and dying. But what lies behind this, I would argue, and Michelle has argued in her thesis, is the importance of relationships and your place in the world, the notion of who is your friend and where do you belong. And there's another quite poignant episode where a little boy says, but if you all die, I'll be left, and that's not fair for my life. So he has this very clear idea somewhere of a social justice, or being abandoned, or being left, and what would happen if he was left alone. So play gives children the opportunities, it gives them the permission to be playing with these really difficult and challenging existential questions. Now, sometimes when we're in the nursery, we think, oh, shall we have a play theme? I know, we'll do hospitals, or we'll do people who help us. No nursery practitioner or early childhood practitioner in their own mind would say, I know, let's play at death and dying for the next 12 months. Because I think you would probably get some very, very strange reactions. But to follow a play theme, Michelle makes the point that for her to follow this play theme for a period of 12 weeks was actually quite brave, because other teachers have commented to her, we would never be allowed to do that, or we would never do that. And she has actually presented at several conferences in her home country, and she's become known as the lady who does death and dying, which is probably not the best compliment to have. So again, it's this powerful combination of children's knowledge, their working theories, which you can see are open to modification over time, and also the funds of knowledge that they are bringing from their homes and home and family practices. So one more example here, because I think this is fascinating. So do you remember when a footballer collapsed on the pitch, and because they have all the kit there, he actually had a heart attack, but they came on and they did revive and resuscitate him. And what I, again, find fascinating about this is when Adam says he didn't even come back alive by a ghost, because in another play episode they'd already established that you can come back to life, but you'll be a ghost or maybe a zombie. I'm not quite sure how you get to be a ghost or a zombie. So you can see this continual checking out of the facts and the working theories that maybe need some adjustment. And Peter is absolutely certain, isn't he? He's the authority. That's not true. And I love the way that children have recourse to a higher authority. He says that's not true, but my cousin told me. And sometimes it's my dad told me, or my big sister told me. So there is recourse to a higher authority here. Sometimes people can be wrong. So that's the idea, again, they're playing with this. Come in. It's okay. There's a chair over here. Okay. Well, even everyone in the world says it's true. So Adam's recruited everyone in the world to his cause, because he's got to have some way of saying, no, I'm right here. Actually, I am right. And again, you do that thing if you check out with the parents what's been happening at home. So Adam had seen it and had come across the story and did know about it. So just look at the immense diversity, the immense richness of the funds of knowledge that children are bringing into their play. And although we say that play is the stuff of fantasy, which it is, what I think is so interesting as children get older is how much of their play is informed by the real world, the everyday, and importantly, this desire to know, this desire to become more knowledgeable. And I think that's why one of the themes around children's interests is knowledge of the adult world. Children are fascinated by what it means to be an adult. And I don't know why, because you grow up and you just have to go out to work and pay the bills. But it seems a lot more beguiling to young children. And here you can see again that fascination with the world of adults, the wanting to know, wanting the funds of knowledge that adults have in order to be able to explain the immense complexities of the world. So those were just an example of 2 research projects that are focusing on funds of knowledge, children's interests, working theories, to try to develop a much more complex explanation of what is happening in children's play and why it has such immense significance for their learning and development, and why we need to sustain a progressive approach to play. And as Nora said this morning, not just in early childhood, but right through our education system as well. Okay, so my argument is that play progresses in complexity, social organisation and cognitive challenge, and that is very evident in Michelle's work when we compare it with the work from the nursery setting. We're arguing that what lies behind children's interests is this idea of sustained inquiry and engagement with knowledge and wanting to know, and the idea of what it means when you are coming to know something. Sense-making, meaning, inquiry, and being knowledgeable. Being knowledgeable is important because knowledge really is power for young children. And I think this is part of the fascination of the world of adults, because they see adults having way more power than children have. I think play is in continual evolution, revolution, and adaptation. And within that process, the idea of converged play is becoming important. Converged play is the blending of digital and traditional play, not seeing them as separate, but children are becoming so skilled and so adept at moving across and within and between many, many different platforms now. But digital play is a whole other talk for another time. And these 2 pictures fascinate me because they were taken many years apart. But there is a similar energy in the child's digital picture of himself and David Hockney's very expert artist's view of a chair. And you can almost see the way in which the tools influence the artist, and the artist chooses to influence what he or she does with the tools. So I think there is a lovely connection here between those two pieces of art. But I come back to my starting point, because I'm coming back to this idea of dissonance between a lot of the research that I'm reading, not just in the UK, but in international contexts, and the demands of policy frameworks. And we're arguing in a recent paper about the importance of children's dynamic and embodied knowledge, their interests and inquiries, and how these are expressed in multimodal ways. And I come back to the data from the children in the nursery, where they might be labelled as falling behind, as emerging, as being in need of interventions, but perhaps we just need to pay more attention to multimodal ways of expression and build on those ways of expression. We're arguing that we should be sustaining an expansive view of knowledge, skills and concepts that acknowledges diversities and complexities. because we're living in very diverse societies now, and children are living, learning, and bringing so many different sources of knowledge into school communities. That transitions do not need to be abrupt, that they can be smooth, but there must always be structure and flexibility. This is why I do not argue solely for a play-based approach, because not all children learn through play, and some children are really quite happy within more structured approaches. But we need continuity with progression and challenge. And I still think that in education settings, understanding how play progresses and how we resource our settings for progression in play is still a missing dimension. And we really do need to do some seriously hard work on that. So the dissonance then, we're arguing, is about the universally imposed regulated curriculum informed by a linear model of learning. And I don't know whether yours is as linear as ours is in Scotland, as ours is in England, but linearity seems to be disrupted by the kind of research that we're doing. We're arguing against a reductionist view of children's learning. Differences and diversities are constructed as problematic, and as I have argued, there is a danger of children being placed in deficit. Abrupt transitions such as play to work, informal to formal, are not necessary, and the very availability of everything you can do with one of these, the digital world is making a nonsense of a binary between play and work, and a binary between formal and informal learning. And we need to keep up with all of this in education. So here is my model, here is my proposed, it's not a solution, it's a way of thinking about what we can do in our settings to try to address that dissonance. So I think having the cycle, the continuous cycle of the planning, the environment, the activities, very close observation. As we've seen in those two research projects, you learn so much by observing, stepping back, thinking, pondering and wondering about children's learning. And then, of course, assessing, reflecting and evaluating are part of that cycle. So there are two strands that are connected here: child-initiated and adult-directed activities. I don't agree that there should be any kind of prescription that says 50-50 or 60-40, because that ties practitioners up in knots of trying to define what it is they're doing. Child-initiated activities are the closest that they're going to come to free play in an organised setting. Child-initiated and adult-directed activities should be co-constructing and co-informing each other. Adult-directed activities, I think, should be classed as work or non-play. There's no point trying to dress up directed activities as play, because children know when they're being conned. They know when we do that to them. They don't like it. And there's nothing wrong with adult-directed activities, because those are the arenas in which we can follow up on children's ways of knowing, children's knowledge, children's interests, children's funds of knowledge, as well as connecting them with new ideas and new knowledge, skills and understanding. Structured play sits somewhere in the middle. Children often like playing with adults. They will invite you, if you're very lucky, to go and play with them. They like board games. They like games with rules. So there isn't any one mode that should dominate on a weekly basis. Rather, there should be fluidity to go between and across these different modes. So I'm offering that as a way of thinking about how to sustain structure and flexibility within your provision. So, we cannot escape the demands of policy, and neither should we, because they are the levers for ensuring equity and access and inclusion. But here are some questions that I think we can all think about. Curriculum as text. These are very, very powerful documents that we have given to us, handed down to us from governments. But what are the consequences of a centrally regulated curriculum which underestimates the significance of children's play and everyday lives? And in there, I would also include their digital or their converged play. I would argue that curriculum is everywhere, and we've seen that from the data from the nursery children and the data from Michelle's 5 and 6 year old children as well. So in what ways can curriculum build on the social, cultural and material context of contemporary living, of which formal education is just a part? Okay, and I think that's important to remember because children are outside of school longer than they are in school. And what issues does this raise for accountability? Accountability is important, but maybe there are other ways that we can address accountability without the forms of measurement that place some children in deficit. So to whom should curriculum be accountable, and how should this be evaluated? We've seen today that the raw material of curriculum is there in our settings, as well as the curriculum that we are offered through policy frameworks. So how can we approach this in integrated, balanced and flexible ways to ensure that we are doing the best thing, and more importantly, we are doing the right thing by children and families? Thank you very much for listening.